The dean paused with a faint smirk before calling the next name. Gwen leaned slightly towards Stephen, her expression smug, already anticipating her name among the chosen. Gwen Perez, the dean announced first, his tone warm. Gwen stood proudly, chin lifted as applause rippled faintly through the room. Stephen's name followed soon after. Then the dean's voice changed, less enthusiastic as he read on. Philip Paykern. Phil's eyes widened and he smiled, glancing toward Belle with quiet joy. She smiled back, heart fluttering. Then the dean turned the next page, his fingers hesitating ever so slightly before he read, Belle Mirren Perez. The room fell into murmurs. Gwen froze, her smug expression cracking. Belle blinked, unable to process what she'd just heard. She had been chosen. The hospital she dreamed of, the very place Ethan worked, had accepted her. She stood up on trembling legs, clutching her packet, bowing slightly. Congratulations, Miss Perez, the dean said tightly, though his eyes held no warmth. Gwen's jaw clenched, her fingers gripping her pen until it snapped in half. Belle could hear the whispers now. She got in? How? Maybe she's really talented. Or maybe it's her sugar daddy's hospital. One voice hissed, just loud enough. Belle pretended not to hear, keeping her smile steady. She thanked the dean softly and sat again. Phil whispered, You did it, Belle, and she gave him a grateful glance, though her heart still raced in disbelief. When the meeting ended, Gwen strode straight to her father's desk, slamming her folder down. How could you let that girl get into EDV? She hissed. The dean sighed, lowering his voice. The hospital director's office reviewed the scores personally. Her exam was perfect, and her interview was excellent. Even I can't override that without drawing suspicion. Then fix it, Gwen said through clenched teeth. Or she'll think she's my equal. Be patient, her father replied smoothly. There are ways to make her quit on her own. Gwen smiled faintly at that. Outside, Belle and Phil talked excitedly as they walked to the gate. I'm so happy, Phil, Belle said, her face glowing. I can't wait to tell Ethan. You deserve it, Belle. You worked harder than anyone, Phil replied. She nodded, her eyes misty. That evening, she waited at the penthouse, pacing until she heard the familiar sound of the door unlocking. Ethan stepped in, his tie loosened, looking tired but smiling the instant he saw her. Belle! She ran straight into his arms. Ethan, I got in. I'm assigned to EDV Medical Center, she blurted out, voice trembling with joy. He froze, pulling back slightly to look at her. You what? I'm going to intern at EDV. I saw my name on the list. I made it, she said, beaming. Ethan was speechless for a moment. His expression softened into something between pride and worry. That's amazing, Belle, he said at last, hugging her tightly again. You'll do great. I'm proud of you. She leaned into him, relieved and happy. Thank you, Ethan. I wanted to tell you first. You always do, he murmured against her hair. Later, as they sat by the window with dinner, Belle chatted about the orientation. Ethan listened quietly, nodding now and then, but inside he was uneasy. The idea of her walking the same halls as him, among his executives and doctors, unsettled him. Not because he didn't trust her. He trusted her more than anyone, but because he knew how people talked. He had kept their relationship private for that reason. The thought of colleagues whispering about them made his chest tighten. Ethan! Belle's gentle voice pulled him back. You're quiet. Don't you want me to be there? She asked softly, sensing his change. He sighed. Of course I do, Belle. I just want you to be careful. EDV can be demanding. People can be sharp. Promise me you'll focus on your work and not let anyone bother you. I promise, she said, holding his hand. And even if they do, I'll just smile. He smiled faintly, squeezing her fingers. That's my Belle. The following week marked the start of her internship. Belle arrived early, dressed neatly in her white coat, her ID badge gleaming. Her hair was tied back simply, her expression bright but nervous. Mac dropped her off at the staff entrance to avoid attention. She walked through the bustling halls, her heart pounding as she read the name tags around her. EDV felt enormous and intimidating. At the nurse's station, Mitch spotted her and waved. Belle, you're interning here? She asked, surprised but pleased. Yes, Miss Mitch, Belle said, smiling. Congratulations. The staff in your department are kind, But just keep your head down, okay? Mitch advised in a low tone. Belle nodded gratefully. Her first few days went smoothly. She worked hard, took notes diligently, and always spoke respectfully. Her supervisors praised her for being attentive, but whispers soon followed her there, too. "That's the CEO's girl," someone whispered near the lab. "No way. She's just an intern. You think the CEO personally drops off random interns?" Belle ignored them, focusing on her rounds. But one afternoon, when she entered the main corridor with patient files, she saw Ethan walking beside a group of executives. He looked effortlessly imposing in his black suit, his stride calm and authoritative. Their eyes met briefly, and for a second, his expression softened. Belle looked away quickly, remembering his words about keeping things discreet. Gwen's laughter rang from behind. "Look who's pretending to be a real doctor," she mocked, walking past with a clipboard. Belle stayed quiet. "Don't ignore me," Gwen said, stepping closer. "You think you belong here just because you're sleeping your way to the top." Belle flinched but didn't speak. "Careful what you say," a familiar voice warned. Ethan's tone was low, dangerous. He had turned back. Gwen froze. The executives fell silent. Ethan's eyes, cold and sharp, locked on her. "Miss Perez," he said evenly, "I believe interns are expected to show professionalism. If I hear about another disruption, you'll be dismissed from the program immediately." "Yes, Mr. Delville," Gwen stammered. He turned to Belle briefly, his voice softening only a shade. "Miss Mirren, continue with your rounds." She nodded, heart pounding, and walked off quickly. Behind her, she could hear Gwen's shallow breathing, the tremor of embarrassment she tried to hide. That evening, Belle found Ethan in his office, leaning against his desk. She closed the door, quietly, and approached. "Ethan, you didn't have to do that," she said, guilt and gratitude mixed in her voice. "I did," he said firmly. "No one talks to you like that." She smiled faintly, stepping closer. "Still, thank you." He brushed a hand over her hair, then lowered his forehead to hers. "I told you to keep your head down, not to let them walk over you. I'll protect you when I have to. Always." "I know," she whispered. He smiled slightly. "How was your first week?" "Tiring," she said honestly, then added with a small laugh. "But I think I'm learning a lot." "Good," he said. "That's what matters." Her gaze lifted to his, her voice soft. "Can we celebrate tonight?" "Just us." His lips curved. "You always know how to tempt me." She grinned. "Then don't resist." That night, the city glowed outside the penthouse windows. Belle curled beside Ethan on the couch, their laughter soft against the quiet hum of the skyline. For a while, the world beyond the glass didn't matter. No deans, no whispers, no titles. Just them, holding on to the fragile peace they built together. But the peace wouldn't last. The next day, a rumor began spreading across the hospital, one that reached even the director's office. A photo, blurry but recognizable, showed the CEO and a young intern standing close at the staff elevator. The gossip caught fire fast, fueled by envy and curiosity. By noon, it had spread through nearly every department. Ethan sat in his office, the image printed on his desk. Pete stood nearby, grim-faced. "It's circulating everywhere," Pete said quietly. "HR's trying to trace the source, but the damage is done." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And Belle? She doesn't know yet," Pete said. "But she will soon." Ethan exhaled sharply, his mind already spinning through solutions. He could deny, control the narrative, or ignore it, but none of those would protect Belle from the whispers that would follow. He stared at the photo again, at Belle's shy smile, and made his choice. He picked up his phone. "Call a press meeting," he told Pete. "This afternoon." Pete blinked. "You're going to confirm it?" "I'm going to end the rumors," Ethan said quietly, eyes hard with resolve. And for Belle, everything was about to change again. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung low over the silent house. Ethan sat by the window, his hands clasped together, the knuckles, white against the dark fabric of his coat. The faint sound of dripping water echoed through the halls like a slow-ticking clock, reminding him that time hadn't stopped, even though everything else felt like it had. Downstairs the candles had burned low, leaving trails of wax on the wooden table. Belle's scent lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable, a soft mix of lavender and something he could never quite name. It haunted him the same way her eyes had when she looked back at him for the last time before the storm. He thought about the letter. He had never sent the words he could never say out loud. They were all there, folded neatly inside the drawer of his desk, waiting like ghosts that refused to rest. Every night, he told himself he would burn it, but every morning it was still there, untouched, unread, unforgotten. Then came the footsteps again, slow and measured across the upper floor. Ethan didn't move. He just listened, his pulse steady, his eyes fixed on the staircase. It wasn't the wind this time, and it wasn't imagination. The boards creaked one by one, closer and closer, until they stopped right above him. He rose, quietly, his boots soundless on the cold floor. The air felt heavier, now colder, like the house itself was holding its breath. He reached for the lantern, lit it, and started up the stairs. The flame flickered, struggling against the damp air. Halfway up, he heard a whisper just behind him, soft like the voice of a memory. Ethan froze, but didn't turn. The whisper came again, clearer now, a woman's voice, saying his name the way only Belle ever had. He swallowed hard, the name echoing inside his chest. When he reached the top step, the hallway stretched ahead, long and dim, the doors on both sides slightly ajar, as if someone had just passed through. He walked to the first door and pushed it open. The room was empty except for the faint outline of a figure reflected in the cracked mirror. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't solid, not entirely, but the shape was there, pale eyes watching him through the glass. He stepped closer, but the reflection didn't move. It only smiled, a small, knowing curve of lips that sent a chill down his spine. The lantern trembled in his grip as the shadow behind the glass began to fade, blending into the dark until nothing remained but his own reflection staring back at him, hollow and uncertain. He turned away, closing the door, slowly, trying not to make a sound. At the end of the hallway, another door creaked open on its own. Ethan followed, drawn by something he couldn't explain. Inside the room, the air was colder, the walls damp with the smell of earth and rain. A single candle burned on the desk beside a small wooden box. He recognized it immediately. Belle's music box, the one that played their song when the world was still kind. He reached out and touched it. The lid opened by itself, and the melody began to play, soft, fragile, like it was afraid of being heard. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Then he saw it. Etched into the wood was a name, his name beside hers, carved deep and uneven, as if done in a hurry before leaving. The sound grew louder, filling the room until it drowned out everything else, the whisper, the wind, the beating of his heart. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he could see her again, standing by the window, smiling like she used to, her hair moving with the breeze, her eyes bright and alive. Then she was gone. The music stopped and silence fell heavy and absolute. Ethan stood there for a long time, staring at the box until the candle flickered and died, leaving him alone with the darkness. Downstairs the clock began to chime, marking the hour. He took one last look at the box, closed it gently, and whispered something only the house would hear. Then he walked away, but as he reached the staircase, a faint hum rose from behind him. The music box had started playing again. The melody drifted through the house like a slow heartbeat, echoing off the empty walls. Ethan stopped halfway down the stairs, his hand gripping the railing. The tune was softer now, but it carried weight like a memory refusing to die. He turned his head, slightly listening, his breath shallow. The box was still upstairs, yet the sound seemed to come from everywhere, from the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath his feet. He went back up the steps one by one, the lantern trembling in his hand, the flame bending under each breath of cold air. When he entered the room again, the candle was burning once more, though he had seen it die moments before. The box sat in the same place, lid open, turning slowly by itself, the tiny dancer inside moving with a rhythm too perfect, too alive. Ethan set the lantern down on the desk, the light falling across the carvings on the box. The wood looked darker now, wet as if it had absorbed something from the air. He reached forward, but stopped when the dancer turned her head slightly and faced him. The figure was no longer still. The small porcelain face now carried expression, soft eyes painted blue now glimmered like real ones, and the mouth curved into a faint familiar smile. His hand fell away, his pulse rising. The air grew colder, and his breath came out in short, visible streams. The music changed, too slower, deeper, each note stretching longer than it should. He whispered her name, once, then again louder. The dancer froze, the music stopped, and the silence that followed was unbearable. He stepped back, but the door behind him slammed shut, shaking the floor. The lantern's light flickered once, twice, and went out. Total darkness swallowed the room. He could hear the music again, faintly this time behind him, not from the box but from the corner of the room where no light reached. He turned slowly, the boards groaning under his feet. There she was. Belle stood in the corner, her dress pale, her hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. Her skin glowed, faintly almost blue against the dark. Her eyes were on him, steady, calm, filled with something that wasn't anger but wasn't peace either. Ethan took a step forward, his throat tight, his voice weak, when he spoke her name again. She didn't move, but the sound of the music box grew louder, as if responding to her presence. She raised one hand, and the box on the table snapped shut on its own, the lid slamming like a heartbeat. The room fell silent. She started walking toward him, each step slow, the sound of her bare feet soft against the floor. Ethan couldn't move. His body refused. When she stopped in front of him, he could see the faint shimmer of tears on her cheeks, the same tears she had shed the night she left. Her lips parted, and her voice came out quiet but clear. "You promised you wouldn't forget." The words cut through him deeper than any blade. He shook his head, trying to speak, but no sound came out. She lifted her hand and touched his face, her fingers cold like winter water. For a second the world shifted, and he saw it all again, the night of a storm, her leaving the letter, the door, closing the silence that followed. He had buried it, tried to move on, but she had waited here, trapped between the echoes of what they once were. Belle's eyes softened, and she whispered something he could barely hear, but he understood every word. It was not a curse, it was not anger. It was goodbye. The cold mist lifted, and she began to fade, the light from her form dissolving like mist at dawn. Ethan reached for her, his hands passing through the air where she had been. The lantern flickered back to life, weak at first, then steady. The box lay open on the table, the dancer, motionless, her head turned toward him. He stood there for a long time, unable to move, until the candle burned low again. When it finally went out, he picked up the box and left the room, closing the door behind him. Downstairs the house was still. The rain had started again, light and steady against the windows. Ethan sat by the fireplace, lit it, and watched the flames rise. He placed the music box on the mantel, the melody no longer playing, yet its silence felt alive. He stayed there until dawn, the first light of morning creeping across the floor. When the sun touched the box for the first time, it played on its own, one final time, soft and brief. Ethan smiled for the first time in years, a tired, quiet smile meant only for her. The melody faded into the light, and the house finally rested. Weeks passed before Ethan opened the door to that room again. The house had gone quiet since that night, no more whispers, no footsteps above the ceiling, no soft crying behind closed doors. Still he could feel her presence, not in fear, but in the faint calm that followed, lost, the kind that stays when everything else is gone. He walked through the hallway, the boards creaking beneath his boots, the morning light falling through the cracked windows in pale lines. Dust hung in the air, soft and slow like snow. The smell of rain had faded, replaced by old wood and time. When he reached the room, he paused, his hand resting on the door frame, listening for the silence on the other side. Then he pushed the door open. The air inside was dry now, the candle melted into a pool of wax long hardened. The music box sat exactly where he had left it, untouched, but somehow it seemed older, like years had passed in a single night. He crossed the room and picked it up, the wood cool against his skin. The carvings of their names were still there, faint but visible, the edges worn smooth as if by countless touches. He opened it carefully, half expecting the melody to begin again, but it didn't. The dancer stood still, frozen in her final pose, her face turned toward him. For a long moment he just stared, then smiled faintly. She looked peaceful now, like whatever spirit had moved her before had finally gone home. He carried the box downstairs and placed it beside the window where the sun touched it through the glass. Outside, the garden had begun to grow wild grass, reaching high against the stone wall, flowers breaking through cracks in the path. He hadn't tended it since the night she died. Now it looked almost alive again, as if nature itself had decided to heal what he couldn't. Ethan poured himself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the trees move gently with the wind. He thought about leaving the house, selling it, starting over somewhere far away. But each time he imagined it, he saw her face reflected in these walls and the light that crossed the floor at dawn. This house had become her memory, her voice, her final rest. Leaving it would feel like leaving her twice. He began writing again the way he used to before everything changed. Not letters this time, but stories, small ones about the village, about people who waited and those who never came back. Each night, he wrote by the fire, and when the pages filled, he placed them in a drawer beside the music box. He never signed his name. It didn't matter. The words were for her. One evening as he sat writing, he noticed something he hadn't before. A faint sound from the fireplace, not music, but the soft rhythm of breathing. He looked up, heart still steady, not afraid, just curious. The flames flickered for a moment, bending like someone had passed in front of them. Then he saw it on the wall, opposite the fire, a faint shadow, two shapes side by side. One of them was his, the other wasn't. He didn't move. The warmth from the fire spread through the room, and the shadows didn't fade. They stayed there quietly until the flames died down. Then they disappeared. Ethan smiled and whispered softly to the empty room. He didn't say her name, but she would have known. Years passed like that, slowly, gently. The seasons changed, the roof aged, the wood darkened, but the peace remained. Visitors who passed the old road sometimes said the house looked strange at night, light glowing faintly from within, though no one had lived there for years. Some swore they heard faint music when the wind blew, right, a delicate tune that stopped as soon as they listened too closely. They didn't know about Ethan or Belle, or the promise that had bound them to this place. They only knew that the house by the hill was quiet and beautiful, and sometimes a shadow moved behind the window, even though no one was home. And inside on the mantel the music box still stood, its carvings faded, its dancer still forever turned toward the light, waiting for a song that would never end. Years slipped away, quietly like leaves carried by a slow river. The village below the hill changed, new roofs replaced the old. Laughter filled the market again, and strangers forgot the stories about the man who lived alone in the house above the trees. But the house still stood solid and patient against time, its windows gathering dust, its doors holding the memory of the footsteps that once moved through it. Ethan had grown older, his hair now the color of the clouds that rolled over the valley each morning. He rarely left the house except to walk down to the edge of the woods, where the air smelled of pine and damp earth. Each evening he returned before dusk, lit the same small fire, and sat beside it until the last spark went out. The music box still rested on the mantel, silent now, but sometimes when the fire burned low he thought he heard a note, faint and trembling, just enough to stir the air. One winter the snow came early and stayed longer than it ever had before. The path to the village disappeared, the trees bowed under the weight of ice, and the silence outside became almost holy. Ethan spent those days wrapped in a wool coat, sitting by the window, watching the world turn white. The cold crept into the cracks of the walls, but he didn't mind. He said it made the house feel alive again, breathing slow like it used to when she was here. He began carving again during that winter. Small wooden figures, each one shaped with quiet care. A bird, a tree, a woman holding a lantern. He placed them on the windowsill one by one, as if building company out of memory. Sometimes he would talk to them softly, telling them about the garden, about the wind that still whispered her name through the trees. One night as the storm outside raged louder than before, Ethan woke to a sound he hadn't heard in years. The melody, soft, uncertain at first, then clearer, rising through the house like a sigh. He sat up, heart steady but heavy, and followed it. The music came from downstairs, the same tune he had thought would never play again. When he reached the room, the fire had burned itself low, just embers glowing faintly red. The music box was open, the dancer turning slowly, her porcelain face catching the flicker of the flame. He smiled, not afraid, not surprised. He walked closer, the floor creaking beneath his steps, and sat down beside it. He didn't speak at first, only listened. The song was exactly the same, gentle, tender, the sound of forgiveness wrapped in sorrow. Then he whispered her name once, and for the first time in many years it didn't echo. It felt answered. The room grew warmer. The shadows on the walls began to move, not from the fire, but from a soft light that seemed to come from nowhere. It shimmered like morning fog, taking shape slowly until he saw her again, Belle, standing by the window, her face calm, and her eyes filled with the same quiet love that had haunted him all his life. Ethan didn't rise. He simply watched her as the light gathered around her form. She smiled and walked toward him, her steps light as air. When she reached him, she knelt beside the chair, just as she used to, and placed her hand on his. The cold that had filled his bones for years vanished. He spoke softly, telling her that he had kept his promise, that he never left, that the house had been hers as long as it stood. She listened, her smile never fading, her hand still resting in his. The music slowed. The final notes lingered like a heartbeat. Then she leaned closer and whispered something he had waited a lifetime to hear. "Come home." The melody stopped. The light grew bright for a moment and then faded gently, filling the whole room in a soft golden glow. When the villagers came weeks later, they found the house quiet and warm despite the snow outside. Ethan sat in his chair by the fire, his eyes closed, a faint smile on his face. The music box was open beside him, the dancer still turned toward him, frozen mid-turn. No one ever touched it. They buried Ethan beside the garden where the wildflowers bloomed each spring, and the house was left as it was. But on quiet nights when the wind carried softly through the trees, those who walked near the hill swore they could hear faint music drifting through the air, a melody of love that never truly ended. Decades passed, and the old hill house stood untouched by time. The paint peeled from its walls, the garden grew wild and thick, the roof leaned slightly toward the valley, but the heart of the place remained the same, still whispering with the memory of the man and woman who had once lived there. The villagers below spoke of it softly, now not as a haunted house, but as a resting one where peace had finally found its home. Children grew up hearing the stories of Ethan and Belle told in quiet tones by their grandparents around small fires on cold nights. Some said that on summer evenings when the moon rose full and white you could see two faint figures standing at the window, their outlines glowing gently in the dark. Others claimed that if you listened closely when the wind came from the east, you could hear the faint echo of a song drifting down the hill. The house became part of the land itself, its silence, no longer heavy, but kind of memory rather than a warning. Moss climbed the stones, wildflowers filled the path, and birds built nests in the corners of the broken windows. Nature wrapped the house gently, as if protecting what remained of their love. One spring a traveler arrived in the village. She was young, carrying a notebook and camera, her eyes wide with the curiosity of someone chasing stories. The villagers told her about the hill and the old music box that still stood inside untouched for nearly 50 years. They warned her not to disturb it, not out of fear but out of respect. She listened, nodded, and the next morning began her climb up the winding path through the trees. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of rain. When she reached the top, she stood quietly for a long moment, taking in the sight of the house. It was beautiful even in its ruin, the way forgotten things often are. The door creaked. When she pushed it open, the sound echoing softly through the empty rooms. Dust hung like a veil in the air, sunlight breaking through the cracks in thin bright lines. She walked slowly, her steps light the floorboards groaning beneath her weight. Each room seemed to hold its own story, old furniture draped in sheets, faded pictures leaning against the walls, the smell of wood smoke long gone. When she reached the living room, she stopped. The music box sat on the mantel, exactly where the villagers had said it would. The carvings were almost gone, worn smooth by time, but still faintly visible, two names joined together by a small carved heart. She touched it gently, her fingers tracing the lines. The box was cold, but when she opened the lid, it began to play instantly, as if it had been waiting for her. The melody filled the room, soft and sweet. The dancer turned slowly, her porcelain face cracked but graceful, her movements steady. The traveler stood frozen, the sound surrounding her wrapping the room in warmth. For a moment, she thought she saw something in the reflection of the glass beside the mantel, a figure standing behind her, another by the window, both faint and filled with light. She turned quickly, but the room was empty. Only the music continued, gentle as a whisper. She smiled, then closed the lid. The tune stopped, but the warmth in the air remained. She looked around once more, then wrote something in her notebook before leaving. When she returned to the village that evening, she told no one what she had seen. But that night she sat by her window in the small inn and wrote the story down word for word. She called it The House That Waited. Years later, that story was published and read by thousands. Some believed it was fiction, others thought it was truth disguised as legend. But those who lived near the hill knew better. On quiet nights, the music still drifted down faint and slow, the sound of love that had never died. And sometimes when the moonlight touched the old glass window, two shadows appeared side by side, one taller, one smaller, their hands almost touching as if frozen in a moment that refused to fade. Many years later, the story of the Hill House became something more than a legend. It became a pilgrimage of sorts for those who believed in love that outlasted life. Artists came to paint it, poets came to sit beneath its broken windows, musicians came to listen, hoping to catch a hint of the tune that still played when the wind shifted. The villagers watched from afar, never interfering, always leaving flowers at the base of the hill, each spring in quiet remembrance of Ethan and Belle. The traveler who had written the house that waited grew old herself. Her name was Clara, and though her life took her far from that village, she never forgot the day she first heard the music box sing. In her final years, she returned gray-haired, and gentle, her steps slow, but her eyes still bright. She climbed the hill again, this time with more effort than before, but with the same quiet wonder that had filled her youth. The door was still there, hanging crooked but strong. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and old rain. The music box still sat on the mantel, its dancer frozen mid-turn, just as she remembered. Clara smiled and placed a small envelope beside it. Inside was a letter written in her careful hand, a farewell not just to the story, but to the memory of the love that had inspired it. She closed the lid softly and left the house one last time. When she passed a few months later, the villagers climbed the hill to honor her memory. They found the letter still beside the box, unopened and dry. It read simply, "I heard the song again. Thank you for keeping it alive." After that, no one entered the house for decades. Nature took what was left, vines wrapped around the walls, trees grew close, and roots cracked the stone steps. But the structure never collapsed. It stood through storm and snow and heat, its heart unbroken. And those who walked the path below swore the melody was still there, hidden among the leaves, faint but unmistakable. Then one autumn morning, a young boy from the village, chasing his lost kite, wandered too far and found himself at the foot of the house. The door was slightly open, the wind moving it back and forth with a tired creak. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside, curious and fearless. Dust filled the air, golden in the sunlight that streamed through the gaps in the roof. He saw the music box, at once drawn to it as if it called him. When he touched it, the lid lifted without resistance, and the song began again after nearly half a century. The sound was clear, as if new notes had been born in silence. The dancer spun, slowly, the cracked porcelain glowing softly in the light. The boy listened, eyes wide, his small heart filled with wonder. Then he noticed something etched freshly on the side of the box. A carving, shallow but clear, 2 initials joined together, just like before, but this time there was a third one beneath them. EBC, Ethan, Belle, Clara. The boy didn't understand, but he smiled, closed the lid, and ran back to the village to tell what he had seen. The villagers went up that evening to see for themselves. They found the box exactly as he had described it, still warm to the touch, though the house was cold. No one could explain it, but no one tried. They only nodded quietly and left the hill as it was untouched, sacred. Years rolled into decades again, and the forest around the house thickened until only the roof and one window could be seen from the path below. The story of Ethan and Belle faded from the mouths of the old, but remained in the hearts of the young. Sometimes they told it at weddings, sometimes at gravesides, always ending the same way, with the words, "The song never stopped." And it never did, because even now, when the wind carries through that valley on quiet nights, a faint tune rises from somewhere deep among the trees, soft, slow, and full of peace, the kind of song that belongs only to those who loved once and forever. But the song that lingered through the valley did not remain just a sound. It became something that moved through time itself, weaving into dreams, into paintings, into stories told by candlelight. Children born generations later would wake from sleep humming the same tune their parents had never taught them, their grandparents had never sung. The melody seemed to belong to the soul of the place, a reminder of something once lost but never gone. By the time another century passed, the village had changed into a town, its dirt paths turned to quiet roads, its lanterns replaced by pale electric light, but the hill remained untouched. People called it the Hill of Hearts, a name that grew naturally from stories whispered for so long that no one remembered the first person who said it. Couples would climb it on the night of the harvest moon and leave wildflowers by the door for good fortune. Some swore they heard soft laughter inside the walls, others claimed a woman's gentle voice sang along with the music box when the air was cold enough. One winter, the town council decided to restore the old house. They sent workers to clear the vines and repair the roof. But something strange happened. Each morning the workers arrived to find their tools, scatter their ladders, tipped their blueprints, soaked by dew though the sky had been clear. None were hurt but all felt uneasy, and after a week they left quietly without finishing. The council gave up saying the hill would stay, as it was a piece of the town's soul too stubborn to be changed. Many years later a girl named Isla moved to the town with her grandmother. Isla was quiet and curious, and often wandered near the woods, sketchbook in hand. One afternoon while following a stray cat she found herself before the same crooked path that led up the hill. She had heard the stories of course, but something about the silence felt inviting, not frightening. She climbed slowly, each step softer than the last, until the shape of the old house appeared between the trees. It was beautiful in a ruined sort of way, sunlight breaking through the roof like gold ribbons, the air filled with the scent of moss and old wood. Isla stepped inside, dust floating around her like snow. On the mantel, she saw the music box exactly as people had described it, its surface dull but intact. She brushed her fingers over it and felt a warmth that startled her. Without thinking, she opened it, and the melody rose again, soft and full as if no time had passed at all. The cat sat by the door, watching with wide green eyes. Isla smiled and whispered, "So it's true." The song filled the room, wrapping around her until she felt tears on her cheeks for reasons she couldn't name. She turned the box over and found the carved initials, EBC, just as the boy long ago had seen. She traced them gently, and for a heartbeat thought she saw a faint light move through the letters like breath. When the song ended, she closed the lid and sat on the dusty floor, sketching the box as carefully as she could, every line, every crack, every shadow. From that day, Isla returned often. She brought flowers, sometimes books, sometimes nothing at all. The townsfolk began to notice the hill glowing softly in the evenings when she was there, as if the house itself had come alive again. The mayor once asked her what she did up there. She only smiled and said, "I listen." Years passed. Isla grew up, became an artist, known for paintings that seemed to hum with invisible sound. Her most famous piece was called The Song Between Worlds, a portrait of a ruined house under moonlight with faint silhouettes at its window. Those who stood before it in silence swore they could hear faint music. When asked about the figures she painted, Isla always said they were the ones who waited. On her final exhibition day, an old woman approached her and said the tune reminded her of a melody her mother had sung to her as a child. Isla smiled and replied softly, "Then it means they still remember you." When Isla passed years, later her ashes were scattered on the hill. The next spring, the first wild lilies bloomed there in decades, white against the green. And on still nights, travelers walking the road below sometimes heard not one melody, but two twining together, one deep, one light, moving like wind and heart and time itself. The house still stands watching the town that once feared it, the walls cracked but proud, the roof scarred but strong, and the song still drifts down the hill, now joined by laughter soft and distant like a promise kept through ages. Those who believe say that the house is no longer haunted, but alive, filled with the souls who found peace there, Ethan, Belle, Clara, Isla, and every heart that ever loved too deeply to disappear. And so the wind keeps carrying their song across the valley, into dreams, into hearts, into forever.